Welcome to Clinical Lab Chat, part of the MedCore Podcast Network. I'm Chris Wolski, Director of Business Intelligence for CLP, and today we'll be talking about HPV sample self-collection and what it means for the diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of HPV and cervical cancer. Now, joining me fresh from addressing the UN General Assembly is Dr. Jeff Andrews, a board-certified gynecologist and Vice President of Global Medical Affairs for Diagnostic Solutions at BD. So, Jeff, welcome. We've talked in the past about various women's health issues. I'm excited about this. So, let's get right into it. So, why are self-collection kits as an option important for cervical cancer screening? I mean, why is this a big deal?
In countries where there's widespread opportunities to be screened and reminders, there's still a subset of eligible people who don't get screened. They're either never screened or not screened frequently enough. And we're trying to find ways to reach everybody. And there are a number of barriers to having a clinician exam, which involves an exam room, getting up on a table with stirrups, speculum, all that sort of thing. It involves making an appointment, transportation, missing time at work, worrying about childcare. So we know that women would prefer a private method of sampling. Switching from Pap testing, which was the smear made on a slide, to HPV screening, permits a self-collection as the method of obtaining the sample for HPV, and that can be done anywhere, really. So we're starting with in-clinic, in-lab type of self-sampling within the U.S., and then moving toward at-home testing.
Okay. So can you give me an overview, or give us an overview of how self-collection works? I mean, we talk about it all the time. How does that work? Is it kind of the same as like when you go and give a urine test or a urine sample? You're going into a bathroom and using a little kit. How does that work?
Well, outside the U.S., people are offered this test, and it arrives at their home. They open the box and read the instructions, self-sample, send the sample back with a return envelope. The lab receives it, gives the result to their physician. The physician contacts the patient with the result. In the U.S., at the moment, the FDA has approved what's called in-healthcare facility testing. And you're right, Chris, it's very similar to what we do now if we're asked to give a urine sample.
Okay.
So the person goes into a private room, either at the doctor's office or clinic or lab, and then they read the instructions, obtain the self-collected swab sample, and then they give that back to a healthcare worker in that facility who labels it and sends it to the lab, just like they do all the other samples that are collected there. So then the lab reports the result to the clinician notifies the patient. The last mile, the next step, is to move that sampling into the person's home, and obviously mail or ship the kit to the home and mail or ship it back to the lab.
Right. Now, coincidentally, while I was preparing for this podcast, I read a study that indicated that a lot of misdiagnoses are related to poor sample handling, and that's something that kind of when I was when we were first approached about this, I was thinking about. So while self-collection is certainly a giant positive step forward, how is sample integrity? Is this something that clinicians need to be worried about with a self-collection test like BD's?
You're right, Chris. It's very important to validate the self-sample, and this begins with the collection device, which may be a swab or a brush of some kind, and then whether that is immediately put into a liquid or whether it's maintained as a dry sample. The integrity of that over time and temperature before it reaches the lab, and then how the lab processes that sample before putting it on the instrument. So we now know internationally that we need an end-to-end validation of self-collection. It can't be just any swab, any HPV assay with any type of lab assessment. It needs to follow a specific script. So BD has worked over a number of years to validate our technique. We were the first to get a CE mark for self-collection in Europe. We were the first to get Therapeutic Goods Association approval in Australia, and et cetera. We were one of the first to get the FDA approval, and we're the first to be shipping these kits to clinics and labs around the U.S.
Okay. Now, so I'm thinking even more fundamentally as well, but just the sample collection itself, because when I go to the doctor's office, I have to give a urine sample. I'm always worried that I'm going to somehow contaminate it, and it's going to be some sort of an issue. Are the instructions pretty straightforward? Is this something that's along the lines of, say, like I know it's very different, but along the lines of the swab kits with COVID? I mean, it's pretty hard to mess those up. Is it along the same lines in terms of collecting the sample?
It's similar. Since the person is doing it themselves, they can't really contaminate. But it is very important to have an internal control so that the lab instrument checks that there's human material in the sample. Because if you just opened it and put it back in the envelope, never sampling yourself, that would result in a negative internal control. And the physician will be notified that the result was unreportable and should be repeated.
Right. Okay, I got it. All right, and then you kind of indicated this, but I want to be clear. This is currently only available in physicians' offices, so patients can't order this at home. Is that right? Or at least in the U.S. anyway.
It's correct. The FDA refers to it as in healthcare facility, which is any place where there's a healthcare provider in a private room. So doctor's office, clinic, the lab that you go to, where, as you mentioned, people now might show up at the lab and get blood and then also do a urine collection. But also some pharmacies that have clinical services in a private room could also participate.
Okay. And do you think, when do you think patients will have an at-home version? Is that something that BD is working on at this point?
Yes, we've been working on it for years, actually, and we're partnered with the National Cancer Institute and the FDA in this approach. The National Cancer Institute received a grant from NIH to pursue this research. We were set to do the research in 2020, but when the pandemic came along, it was determined that we shouldn't enroll people in clinical research and unnecessarily expose them to COVID-19. So that ended up being postponed. That study finally restarted this month, and so we're pursuing those claims through a study called the SHIP trial, which is run by the National Cancer Institute under something called the Last Mile Initiative. Last mile meaning let's reach all the women who so far have not been reached, women and people with a cervix.
Right. Okay. And so let's talk a little bit. Our audience is primarily laboratorians and lab managers. Where does the clinical lab fit into this home or this self-collection continuum? I mean, are laboratories still necessary to process the test, and are there ways that their workflows are going to change because of this sort of test?
It's amazingly similar, Chris. The one difference is the lab would need to work with their clinicians to add an order in the electronic medical record that's specific to a self-collection. But other than that, the sample is processed on the instrument very similarly. Our instrument's able to recognize that this is a self-collected vaginal swab and run it appropriately for that. That's part of the barcode labeling.
Right.
The lab bills for HPV testing the exact same way they do today for a clinician-collected HPV test. So really the only change is working between the lab and the clinicians who use that lab to say that we're offering this now and to add that in the electronic medical record as an order.
Okay. Okay. So it is it's still critical to let the labs. I mean, the only thing that may change in the workflow is that being alerted that it was a self-collected swab. In other words, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. But as you know, the alternative is samples that come either in a thin prep 20 mil vial or a SurePath 10 mil vial, and those look very, very different than a self-collected
Okay.
sample. So I don't think there could be any confusion, but it's important to get the ordering and labeling correct.
Right. Right. Of course. Just in case something happens. All right. So I want to go a little broader here. I think personally, we don't talk enough about public health in the U.S. But this is an important public health step for public health, right? So, in other words, what's the bigger societal impact for the self-screening options for HPV? I mean, how is this going to help not only individual women but our whole society? In other words,
We know for a fact, and this is something that came up at the United Nations General Assembly meeting, that it is possible to eliminate cervical cancer and in addition prevent 5 other cancers that are caused by HPV.
oh wow,
And that requires vaccination, screening, and then treatment for anyone who has the appropriate abnormality after screening. So the vaccination piece is actually going fairly well, and it's actually going to get better and expand even more. The screening piece has been lagging somewhat, and we know that we haven't brought down the incidence of cervical cancer in the last few years, and it's because we're not reaching everybody.
right,
So not only will self-collection be something that some of these folks might take up, but just the news about it, the podcast we're doing today, it
yeah,
reminds people that this is something important to be screened for. So I know in Denmark, where they've been doing self-collection for a long time, many of the women who received the invitation to self-collect because they have not had the clinician-collected screening decide to make the appointment for clinician-collected screening. That's fine. However you get screened, the important thing is to be screened. And then the third part is making sure everyone who has a high-grade lesion gets treated for that. And these are the WHO 90, 70, 90 goals to be reached by every country by the year 2030, and to reduce cervical cancer in every country, but ultimately to eliminate it as a public health threat.
right, right. Yeah, it's just amazing how this is such a preventable disease, and we have all these tools, and I will talk about that in a minute. Now, you mentioned that you recently attended the United Nations General Assembly, where there were a lot of conversations about HPV and early detection. What are some of the key takeaways? You talked about, I think, a couple of them, but what are some of the other key takeaways on screening and prevention of HPV and cervical cancer that came out of that?
Well, thanks, Chris. This has been a topic for global health and international health for a number of years, but movement has been slow. But more recently, a number of countries have begun to seriously get behind this, to put funding themselves, but also to get matching funding from World Bank and other sources. And we see a much greater uptake. So there are countries, as you know, that host the G7 or G20 congresses, and as a host country, a number of them have taken up this charge of eliminating cervical cancer, such as Italy and Indonesia, India. And so they're having remarkable progress. Just before the UN General Assembly, President Biden had an event related to the White House Cancer Moonshot in Delaware, where he had the heads of state from Australia, Japan, and India join him for what they call the Quad. And those 4 countries are working to assist all the countries in the Indo-Pacific with cervical cancer elimination through primary prevention with vaccination, as well as secondary prevention, which is the screening. They introduced a very large number of initiatives with funding behind it, and this is going to make a very large difference. So there's a lot happening right now, and I expect it to be carried through the next year. That was part of what was happening at UNGA, was these ministers of health joining together to continue the commitment into 2025, and to keep adding more countries and attempting to reach that goal.
Okay. Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. I mean, why now? Why has this become kind of a big initiative for so many countries across the world right now? I mean, was there a tipping point that led to this?
I think that's a great question, Chris, because if you talk to different countries, there are numerous healthcare challenges in their country, and so it's why now and why this? Why should we tackle this? And I think it's become clear that it's actually possible to eliminate cervical cancer. The victims of cervical cancer tend to be in their middle age, head of the household, mothers,
Right.
workers. It's incredibly important to a society that this not happen. In many countries where cervical cancer is the first or second most common cancer, the cancer is detected at a late stage, and the only thing available is palliative care because they don't have trained surgeons. It's radical surgery to treat cervical cancer. They don't have the radiation treatment options, so the most they can do is give medications for pain. But if we
Right.
could prevent this, that would be a great advantage. The other thing that happened was the switch a number of years ago from Pap testing to HPV. It's HPV that makes this possible. HPV is the cause of cervical cancer, and so screening for HPV is much more sensitive, and it's a different modality. You don't need to increase your number of cytologists in the country. You can just put those samples onto a lab instrument. So the advent of HPV testing has really made a shift. The WHO made a declaration that we should eliminate cervical cancer. They set specific targets and goals. They now have, every country has signed the declaration. So I think you're right. There has been a shift for a number of reasons. Looking back, it took a few years to really feel like the tide was turning, but this year I really feel that it is.
Yeah, it really seems to be, and you kind of touched on some of the other larger societal impacts that cervical cancer can have on anywhere in the world. The women who are head of households, or raising children, or working, or what have you. The prime of their lives being felled by this pretty preventable disease, or treatable disease as well. So we have some really good effective preventatives and vaccines. Now we also have good screening against HPV and cervical cancer. What's it going to take, though, to make cervical cancer a thing of the past? We have all these tools, we have all this will. How are we gonna cross the finish line and make this a thing of the past?
So the target population for vaccination is boys and girls 9 to 13, and that's been going on for more than a decade. But people who were already too old when vaccination started haven't had the advantage of vaccination, so they need the screening.
Right.
One of the ideas is to expand vaccination into older age groups, what's called catch-up vaccination. And even if someone's had a positive HPV, they haven't had all the genotypes that are in the vaccine, so there's still a benefit to the vaccination. So one thing is to vaccinate older people. In low and middle income countries, there's a concept of seeing women, let's say at the age 30, and screen and vaccinate on the same day. And that has tremendous advantages. But we definitely need to expand the screening success to as close to 100% as we can get. And then the last one has to do with providing treatment techniques that can be done anywhere in the world. And the one that's currently most popular is called thermoablation, because the device runs on a battery. So previously we've used cryotherapy, for which you need a giant tank of gas, which is hard to obtain, or LEAP, which requires electricity. So this thermal ablation, which has good efficacy, can be done anywhere, and it's easy to train people to do it. And then if you have a precancerous lesion that gets treated by thermal ablation, you don't get cancer, and that's the goal.
Okay. So it's really just to kind of keep ramping things up and making it, more vaccinations if possible, more screening, and certainly treatment for precancerous lesions and that sort of thing. So, and it sounds like a lot of the equipment also, the indication, I know a lot of the focus has been on the developing world or the emerging economies. But what's good, it seems to be good about that, is that you're talking about like more point of care, more portable or easy to use devices that you don't need. That's not very expensive. The cryotherapy stuff. I mean, as you said, the gas, it's expensive. It's a lot of equipment involved. Vaccinations, I believe that there's a move to get from a 2-stage vaccination to a 1-stage vaccination. So it seems like kind of working. I mean, this is kind of interesting because it does seem like kind of working in the emerging economies, that because of their challenges, we're gonna it may move the whole test and treatment paradigm forward even more.
Yes, Chris, and there's one more tipping point factor I could add that came up a number of times during UNGA, which is the issue of health equity, which has been a hot topic for the last few years. So if we look at prostate cancer treatment options and survival, we see tremendous improvement over the last 10, 20 years, but we don't see that with cervical cancer. In fact, cervical cancer has been increasing. So understanding that this is an equity issue has also pushed it forward. For instance, in the African continent, there's an organization of first ladies that are all working toward awareness for cervical cancer and looking for ways to improve vaccination and screening in their own countries. So I think that the concept of health equity is also one of the positive factors.
Yeah. It seems like unfortunately, and it's here in the United States, it's all throughout the world. It's also, you have to have the political will in order to do that, particularly if it's a big public health issue. And it seems like maybe we're getting a little bit of a groundswell in that direction, which certainly is good because of the systems we work in today. So, all right. Unfortunately, though, we've come to the end of our time. Jeff, thanks again, as always, for joining me today and giving us a better understanding of how we can beat cervical cancer and once and for all. I think we should all be really encouraged by what came out of the UN and then what BD is doing, etc. I also want to thank you, the laboratory audience, for listening. Look for more episodes of Clinical Lab Chat in the future. And visit us online at clpmag.com and on all of the major social media platforms. So until next time, be well.